I'm going to talk about the article called What's a Language Anyway? It comes from the website of the magazine called The Atlantic, which provides daily coverage and analysis of breaking news, politics, education, science, culture, and so on. In 2016, they published this article written by John McWhorter, and he is an American academic and teaches linguistics at Columbia University. He is also the author of multiple books concerning the topic language in general. But why should we ask us the question, what is a language? Now, the so-called difference between the two, a language and a dialect, is much more complicated than you might think. When linguists are asked about the difference between the two, they often recall the famous saying of Max Weinreich, and it goes like this: a language is a dialect with an army and navy. Now, in fact, it's not that easy to put your finger on a clear distinction. As the saying suggests, the difference between a language and a dialect was ultimately a political and social distinction, and it had very little to do with the real linguistics. And history and culture played a big part in the foundation of the term language and all the languages we know of today. But a dialect can easily be described as a particular form of a language which is peculiar to a specific region. For example, Cockney, which is mainly spoken around the areas of London. But we use the term language as a generalizing term for a collection of dialects where speakers of different dialects within the same language group can more or less understand each other. But this still doesn't quite answer the question. Also, this definition can be challenged in many different ways. In the article, there are 4 core arguments that can contradict the general opinion on the term language. The first one is intelligibility. The English say that if you can understand it, it's a dialect of your own language. So if you can understand it without too much effort or without training, it's your own language. But there are many examples of different languages that can communicate perfectly with each other. For example, the Danes, the Swedish and the Norwegians can talk perfectly with each other while speaking 3 different languages. The same can be told with German and Dutch, because we can understand approximately 70% of what we say to each other. But on the other hand, there are dialects that are more different than 2 languages. For example, Mandarin and Cantonese, which are dialects of Chinese, are actually more different than Spanish and Italian because they come from the same pedigree. The next argument, it's quite impossible to determine precisely where one language leaves off and the other one begins. So a word in one language can undergo slight alternations in spelling and pronunciation in different regions. So if you can take a look at the map of Europe, the closer these regions are, the differences are hardly noticeable and still mutually understandable. But the farther you go, variation upon variation, it can completely transform a word to the extent that it's actually unintelligible. That makes the dialects on the ends of the spectrum sound like different languages. Now, the next argument, the impact of historical coincidences. Well, history chose one dialect as its standard and put it down on the page. The European languages we know today were once just a melting pot of Roman and Germanic dialects. In each language, a random dialect was chosen as a standard, and it was a written example, which makes the distinction between languages and dialects even more random and illogical. Now, the last argument, here I have a statement that is actually completely false, but is believed to be true. A dialect has no literature or codified rules, which makes it unsophisticated and incapable of expressing abstract thoughts. Now, this can easily be opposed because there is a thing called oral literature. Medieval bards went around the nation and other places singing poems and songs in their own dialect. So actually that's literature. But even more striking, why is a dialect said to be lesser than a language? It is said that a language is much more grammatically complicated because its rules are written down, but according to the Foreign Service Institute, which that has released a list in which they rank languages according to the difficulty to learn them for an English speaker. And what strikes us is that in the last category there are some dialects mentioned that are much more complicated than the languages in the lists. So, for example, Mandarin and Cantonese are dialects of the Chinese language. So we can conclude that the definition of a language is just a standardized version of a dialect, but it was once still a dialect. It was generally agreed upon that this dialect would become the standard, and it was written down for other people to have an example, while a dialect is just a regionally spoken version of a language. But of course, many people seem to disagree with this issue. Trying to draw the lines between languages and dialects is next to impossible. So why don't we just declare the term language as something arbitrary and meaningless? Dialects are all there is.